The frozen Delaware River crackled beneath the ice as General George Washington stood at the bow of the Durham boat, his eyes fixed on the Pennsylvania shore shrouded in pre-dawn darkness. It was December 25, 1776, and the Continental Army was on the verge of collapse. Morale had plummeted to its lowest depths, enlistments were expiring, and the cause of American independence hung by the thinnest of threads. Washington's breath formed clouds in the bitter air as he contemplated the audacious plan that could either save the Revolution or destroy what remained of his ragged army. The surprise attack on Trenton had succeeded beyond all expectations just a week prior, capturing nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers and desperately needed supplies. But now, as British reinforcements under General Charles Cornwallis approached from Princeton, Washington faced an impossible choice: retreat once again or stand and fight against overwhelming odds. The general's weathered hands gripped the boat's edge as he watched his soldiers struggle against the churning waters. These were not the polished professionals of European armies, but farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers who had answered liberty's call. Many marched barefoot through the snow, leaving bloody tracks that marked their passage. Their uniforms were little more than rags, their weapons a mixture of hunting rifles and confiscated British muskets. Captain Alexander Hamilton, Washington's young aide-de-camp, approached with the latest intelligence reports. Sir Colonel Rawle's replacement at Trenton reports that Cornwallis has consolidated his forces at Princeton. They numbered nearly 8,000 men, well-equipped and eager for revenge after our Christmas victory. Washington nodded grimly. His own force had dwindled to fewer than 5,000 effective men, and many of those would see their enlistments expire at midnight on December 31st. The irony was not lost on him. Just as the old year died, so too might the American cause if decisive action was not taken. The crossing had been treacherous, the ice floes threatening to crush the boats, and a northeastern storm making visibility nearly impossible. But Washington had learned valuable lessons from his previous retreats across New Jersey. Speed and surprise were his greatest weapons against the British war machine, and he intended to use both to their fullest advantage. As the last of the artillery pieces were hauled across the river, Washington gathered his senior officers around a makeshift table. The map spread before them showed the road network between Trenton and Princeton, with British positions marked in red ink. General Nathaniel Greene, his most trusted subordinate, traced the route with his finger. "The element of surprise is everything," Washington declared, his voice cutting through the wind. "Cornwallis expects us to retreat westward, deeper into Pennsylvania. Instead, we shall march north to Princeton, while his main force remains concentrated at Trenton." The plan was audacious in its simplicity. While a small force under General Arthur St. Clair would remain at Trenton to maintain the campfires and create the illusion of a full encampment, Washington would lead the main army on a circuitous route through the frozen countryside. By dawn on January 3rd, they would strike at the British garrison at Princeton before Cornwallis could respond. According to historical accounts from the Library of Congress Revolutionary War records, Washington's decision to attack Princeton represented one of the most crucial strategic gambles in American military history. A success or failure of this operation would determine not only the fate of the Continental Army, but the very survival of the American Revolution itself. The column stretched for miles through the frozen New Jersey countryside, a serpentine line of humanity moving through the darkness like a ghostly apparition. Washington rode at the front, his horse's hooves crunching through the snow-crusted ground as he led. Nearly 5,000 men toward their uncertain destiny. The temperature had plummeted well below freezing, and the wind cut through their inadequate clothing like sabers. General Hugh Mercer, commanding the advance guard, urged his men forward despite the deteriorating conditions. Many soldiers had wrapped their feet in rags to prevent frostbite, while others left scarlet stains in the snow where their bare feet had cracked and bled. The march had begun at midnight on January 2nd, following a route that would take them in a wide arc around Cornwallis's position at Trenton. Washington had chosen this path deliberately, knowing that the British general would expect any American movement to follow the main roads. Instead, the Continental Army struggled through farmers' fields and forest paths. Guided by local patriots who knew every twist and turn of the terrain, the risk was enormous. If they were discovered, the entire force could be trapped between Cornwallis's army and the Princeton garrison. As dawn approached on January 3, 1777, the exhausted column finally reached the outskirts of Princeton. The town lay before them like a sleeping giant, its college buildings and modest homes barely visible in the pale morning light. The British garrison, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Malhood, had no idea that nearly 5,000 American soldiers were approaching their positions. Captain James Monroe, who would later become the 5th President of the United States, led a reconnaissance patrol toward the town center. The 19-year-old officer crept through the shadows, observing the British sentries and noting the positions of artillery pieces. His report would prove crucial to the coming battle, though he could not know that a British musket ball would soon shatter his shoulder and nearly claim his life. The American force divided into 2 columns as they approached Princeton. General John Sullivan would lead the main attack along the post road, while General Nathaniel Greene's division would swing around to cut off any British retreat toward New Brunswick. Washington himself would position the artillery under Captain Hamilton to provide support wherever needed most. The first streaks of sunlight painted the eastern sky as the American advance guard encountered British light infantry conducting their morning patrol. The crack of muskets shattered the dawn stillness, and suddenly the carefully planned surprise attack erupted into chaos. Lieutenant Colonel Malhood, a seasoned veteran of European campaigns, quickly rallied his men and began forming defensive lines. The British 17th Regiment of Foot, along with elements of the 40th Regiment and the Queen's Rangers, numbered approximately 1,200 men. Though vastly outnumbered, they possessed superior training and equipment. Their Brown Bess muskets were well maintained, their bayonets sharp, and their discipline honed by years of professional service. General Mercer's brigade bore the brunt of the initial British counterattack. The 60-year-old Scottish-born physician had served with distinction in the French and Indian War, but nothing had prepared him for the ferocity of this engagement. As his men advanced through an orchard on the Princeton battlefield, they encountered Malhood's regulars in a devastating exchange of volleys. The British formed their traditional line of battle, 2 ranks deep, their scarlet uniforms creating a wall of color against the winter landscape. The order to fire rang out across the field, and smoke erupted from hundreds of muskets simultaneously. American soldiers fell like wheat before a scythe, their blood staining the snow beneath their feet. Mercer himself was struck down in the melee, multiple bayonet wounds piercing his body as he tried to rally his retreating men. The sight of their beloved general falling sent ripples of panic through the American ranks. For a moment, it seemed the entire attack might collapse into a rout, just as it had at Long Island and White Plains. But Washington had not brought his army this far to see it destroyed by a single setback. The commander-in-chief spurred his horse forward, riding directly into the gunfire with a courage that would become legendary. His presence on the battlefield, calm and resolute despite the chaos around him, began to steady the wavering American lines. The battle hung in the balance as General Washington rode into the swirling smoke and chaos of the Princeton battlefield. His white horse, made even more conspicuous by the general's imposing figure, presented a perfect target for British marksmen, yet somehow both man and mount remained untouched by the deadly volleys. The sight of their commander-in-chief advancing fearlessly into the teeth of enemy fire sent a surge of inspiration through the faltering American ranks. "Form on me," Washington shouted above the din of musket fire and clashing steel. His voice carried across the battlefield with an authority that had been forged through months of desperate fighting and strategic retreats. The men who had followed him through the darkest days of the Revolution now witnessed their general at his absolute finest, leading from the front when leadership mattered most. Captain Hamilton, despite his youth, had positioned the artillery with tactical precision that belied his 22 years. The battery of 6-pound cannons began to find their range, sending grape shot into the British formations with devastating effect. The Princeton College buildings provided a dramatic backdrop as iron shot shattered windows and scarred the brick facades that had once housed peaceful scholarly pursuits. Colonel Malhood, recognizing the deteriorating situation, attempted to conduct a fighting withdrawal toward the post road. His regulars maintained their discipline, even as American pressure mounted from multiple directions. The British light infantry, trained in the harsh lessons of frontier warfare, used every building and fence line as cover while slowly giving ground. General Sullivan's division, approaching from the south, had finally reached the outskirts of the town proper. Massachusetts and New Hampshire regiments advanced with grim determination, their recent victory at Trenton having restored much of their confidence. The pincer movement that Washington had envisioned was beginning to take shape, with British forces finding themselves increasingly surrounded. The fighting around Nassau Hall, Princeton's main college building, became particularly intense. British soldiers had barricaded themselves inside the structure, using the thick walls as a fortress. American artillery unlimbered in the courtyard, and Hamilton himself is said to have aimed one of the cannons at the building's massive wooden doors. The symbolism was not lost on either side. The battle for American independence was being fought on the grounds of an institution dedicated to learning and enlightenment. As the morning sun climbed higher, the tide of battle began to turn decisively in favor of the Americans. The British garrison, outnumbered 4-1 and attacked from multiple directions, could not maintain their defensive positions. Mahood ordered a general retreat toward New Brunswick, hoping to link up with Cornwallis's approaching forces. The American pursuit proved relentless. Soldiers who had spent months in retreat now tasted the sweet satisfaction of victory. They swept through Princeton's streets, capturing British supply wagons and taking prisoners. The Queen's Rangers, composed largely of American loyalists, fought with particular desperation, knowing that capture might mean execution as traitors. Washington's tactical genius was evident in every aspect of the engagement. By dividing his forces and attacking from multiple directions, he had prevented the British from concentrating their defensive fire. The use of artillery in close support of advancing infantry demonstrated lessons learned from previous defeats. While the speed of the assault had prevented the enemy from establishing strong defensive positions, the casualties told the story of the battle's intensity. General Mercer lay dying from his wounds, his sacrifice having bought precious time for the American assault to develop. Captain Monroe had been carried from the field with a severed artery, his lifeblood staining the frozen ground. Yet for every American who fell, the British losses were even more severe, as reported in David Hackett Fisher's acclaimed work Washington's Crossing. The Battle of Princeton represented a turning point, not just in military terms, but in the psychological warfare that would ultimately determine the revolution's outcome. The victory proved that American forces could meet British regulars in open battle and emerge victorious. The sounds of musket fire gradually faded as the last British resistance crumbled. American soldiers, many of whom had been ready to abandon the cause just days before, now stood victorious on a battlefield littered with the debris of war. Broken muskets, torn uniforms, and abandoned equipment bore silent testimony to the ferocity of the engagement. Washington surveyed the scene with satisfaction tinged by sorrow for the fallen. The victory at Princeton had been dearly bought, but its strategic and psychological value was immense. Word of the triumph would spread throughout the colonies, inspiring new recruits and convincing wavering patriots that the cause of independence was far from lost. The British retreat from Princeton became a rout as American forces pressed their advantage with newfound confidence. Lieutenant Colonel Mulhood's disciplined withdrawal quickly deteriorated into a desperate flight. As his men abandoned equipment and supplies in their haste to escape the pursuing Americans, the psychological impact of the defeat was as devastating as the physical losses, shattering the myth of British invincibility that had dominated the early years of the war. Washington's decision to pursue the fleeing enemy demonstrated the strategic acumen that would later earn him recognition as one of history's great military commanders. Rather than allowing the British to regroup and potentially counterattack, he maintained relentless pressure on their disordered ranks. American cavalry, though limited in number, harassed the retreat, while infantry units secured the abandoned British positions throughout Princeton. The capture of British supplies proved as valuable as the tactical victory itself. The Continental Army, which had been desperately short of everything from gunpowder to winter clothing, suddenly found itself in possession of military stores that would sustain operations for weeks to come. Wagons loaded with muskets, ammunition, and medical supplies fell into American hands, along with a substantial quantity of hard currency that would help finance future campaigns. Captain Alexander Hamilton, whose artillery had played such a crucial role in the victory, now found himself tasked with securing the captured British cannon. The young officer's performance during the battle had impressed Washington, and their relationship would deepen into one of the most important partnerships in American political history. Hamilton's precise gunnery had broken the British defensive line at the crucial moment, allowing the infantry assault to succeed. The civilian population of Princeton emerged from their homes with a mixture of relief and amazement. Many had expected to witness another American defeat, but instead found themselves celebrating a stunning victory. Local residents provided information about British movements and offered assistance to wounded soldiers from both sides, demonstrating the complex loyalties that characterized the war in New Jersey. General Cornwallis, meanwhile, had awakened to the sounds of distant gunfire and the shocking realization that Washington had outmaneuvered him completely. The British commander's force at Trenton was perfectly positioned to crush the Americans, except that the Americans were no longer there. The deception had been complete, and Cornwallis found himself pursuing shadows, while the real battle was being fought 20 miles away. The speed of communication in the 18th century meant that news of the Princeton victory spread slowly but surely throughout the colonies. Riders carried dispatches along the post roads, while newspapers in Philadelphia and New York began preparing special editions to announce the triumph. The psychological impact on American morale was immediate and profound, reversing months of despair and defeat. Dr. Benjamin Rush, the prominent Philadelphia physician and signer of the Declaration of Independence, would later write about the transformation in public sentiment following Princeton, according to his correspondence, which survives in the American Philosophical Society archives. The victory revived the drooping spirits of the Whigs and gave fresh vigor to the operations of government. The battle had breathed new life into the revolutionary cause at its darkest hour. The British response to the Princeton disaster was swift and decisive. General William Howe, commanding British forces in North America, ordered an immediate concentration of troops to prevent further American advances. The easy victories that had characterized the New York campaign were clearly over, and the British would need to adapt their strategy to face a reinvigorated enemy. Washington's army, despite its triumph, remained vulnerable to counterattack. The men were exhausted from the night march and the morning's fighting, while ammunition supplies, though replenished by captured British stores, were still limited. The commander-in-chief made the difficult decision to withdraw from Princeton rather than risk a prolonged engagement with Cornwallis's approaching forces. The evacuation of Princeton demonstrated the same tactical skill that had made the victory possible. American forces withdrew in good order, carrying their wounded and as much captured equipment as possible. The movement was conducted with the precision of a well-rehearsed drill, showing how much the Continental Army had learned from its earlier defeats. As the American column departed Princeton, they left behind a battlefield that would be remembered as a turning point in the war for independence. The frozen ground bore witness to American courage and British defeat, while the damaged buildings of the college stood as monuments to the price of freedom. The tide of war had turned, and with it, the fate of a nation hung in the balance. The news of Princeton's fall reached General Cornwallis. As he was leading his main force north from Trenton, expecting to trap Washington's army against the Delaware River, the British commander's carefully laid plans crumbled in an instant, replaced by the bitter realization that he had been completely outmaneuvered by an opponent he had previously dismissed as incompetent. The psychological shock was as severe as the tactical defeat, marking the end of British confidence in their ability to crush the rebellion through conventional military superiority. Cornwallis immediately reversed his march, driving his men at punishing speed toward Princeton in hopes of catching the Americans before they could escape. The British forces, which had been anticipating an easy victory over a trapped enemy, now found themselves engaged in a desperate pursuit across the frozen New Jersey countryside. The tables had turned completely, with the hunters becoming the hunted. Washington's withdrawal from Princeton demonstrated the strategic wisdom that had kept the Continental Army alive through its darkest hours. Rather than remaining to defend the town against Cornwallis's superior numbers, he recognized that the psychological value of the victory was more important than holding territory. The American force conducted a masterful fighting withdrawal. Using the same tactics that had frustrated British commanders throughout the campaign, the march to Morristown represented more than a simple retreat. It was a strategic repositioning that would allow the Continental Army to threaten British supply lines while remaining safely beyond the reach of major enemy forces. The choice of winter quarters in the hills of northern New Jersey was inspired, providing natural defensive positions while maintaining the ability to strike at British communications. General Nathaniel Greene, whose division had played a crucial role in the Princeton victory, now found himself responsible for organizing the Army's movements during the withdrawal. The Rhode Island native had emerged as one of Washington's most trusted subordinates, his tactical acumen and administrative skills proving invaluable in the complex task of managing a revolutionary army. The British response to the Princeton defeat was swift but ultimately ineffective. General Howe ordered the consolidation of British forces in New York and the immediate reinforcement of threatened positions throughout New Jersey. However, the damage to British prestige was already done, and the strategic initiative had passed to the Americans for the first time in the war. The impact of the Princeton victory extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. Throughout the colonies, recruiting offices that had been virtually empty suddenly found themselves overwhelmed with volunteers eager to join the cause. The demonstration that American forces could defeat British regulars in open battle had shattered the myth of enemy invincibility and inspired a new generation of patriots. European observers, particularly in France and Spain, took note of the American success with considerable interest. The victory at Princeton, combined with the earlier triumph at Trenton, suggested that the rebellion might have more staying power than previously believed. This shift in perception would prove crucial in securing foreign alliances that would ultimately determine the war's outcome. The financial implications of the Princeton victory were equally significant. The capture of British supplies and currency provided immediate relief to the Continental Army's chronic shortage of resources. While the boost to morale encouraged increased private donations to the revolutionary cause, wealthy patriots who had been reluctant to support what seemed like a lost cause now opened their purses with renewed enthusiasm. Intelligence reports reaching British headquarters painted a disturbing picture of American capabilities that had been dramatically underestimated. The speed and precision of Washington's movements, combined with the tactical skill displayed at Princeton, forced a complete reassessment of rebel military potential. The days of treating the Americans as amateur soldiers were clearly over. The Princeton battlefield itself became a symbol of American determination and British vulnerability. Local residents, who had witnessed the dramatic transformation of their peaceful college town into a scene of military triumph, spread word of the victory throughout the region. The story grew with each telling, inspiring hope in communities that had been resigned to British rule. As documented in the Pennsylvania Gazette of January 7, 1777, the Princeton victory marked a most glorious day for the arms of America. The newspaper's account, while necessarily brief due to communication delays, captured the essence of what had occurred. A ragtag army of citizen soldiers had defeated professional troops in open battle, proving that the cause of independence was far from lost. The strategic situation in New Jersey had been completely transformed. British forces, which had controlled most of the state just days before, now found themselves confined to a few fortified positions, while American units roamed freely throughout the countryside. The initiative had passed to Washington, and he would use it to full advantage in the months to come. The victory at Princeton sent shockwaves throughout the British Empire, reaching London approximately 6 weeks after the battle through the fastest available communication channels. King George III, who had been assured that the American rebellion would be crushed before the end of 1776, now faced the uncomfortable reality that his colonial subjects were proving far more resilient than anticipated. The news arrived at a time when Parliament was already questioning the enormous cost of the war and the wisdom of continuing the conflict. Lord North, the British Prime Minister, found himself under increasing pressure to explain how a professional army equipped with the finest weapons and led by experienced officers could suffer such embarrassing defeats at the hands of what he had previously dismissed as a mob of farmers and tradesmen. The Princeton defeat, following so closely on the heels of the Trenton disaster, suggested that British strategy required fundamental revision. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress received Washington's dispatch, announcing the Princeton victory with jubilation that bordered on disbelief. Many delegates had privately begun to doubt whether the cause of independence could survive the military disasters of 1776. But the twin victories in New Jersey had restored their confidence in both the Army and its commander. John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail that the tide is turned and Providence smiles upon our righteous cause. The psychological impact on American morale extended far beyond the halls of government. In taverns and meeting houses throughout the colonies, Ordinary citizens who had been preparing for the worst suddenly found themselves celebrating an almost miraculous reversal of fortune. The victory at Princeton proved that American forces could not only survive against professional European armies, but actually defeat them in open battle. French Foreign Minister Charles Gravier, Comte de Vergennes, studied the intelligence reports from America with growing interest. The victories at Trenton and Princeton suggested that the American rebellion possessed sufficient military capability to potentially succeed, making it a worthwhile investment for France to support as a means of weakening British power. Secret negotiations would soon begin that would lead to the crucial Franco-American alliance. The British military establishment struggled to comprehend how their carefully planned strategy had unraveled so completely. General Howe's campaign, which had seemed so successful in the autumn of 1776, now appeared to have strengthened rather than weakened American resolve. His capture of New York and the conquest of much of New Jersey had proven meaningless if the Americans could continue to field effective military forces. Washington's army, now safely established in winter quarters at Morristown, had been transformed from a demoralized rabble into a confident fighting force. The knowledge that they could defeat British regulars in battle had restored the self-respect that had been lost during the long retreat across New Jersey. Officers and men alike carried themselves with a new pride that would sustain them through the challenges ahead. The recruiting effects of the Princeton victory were immediate and dramatic. Young men who had been reluctant to join what appeared to be a losing cause now eagerly enlisted in the Continental Army. The Massachusetts and Connecticut militias, which had been virtually disbanded after the New York defeats, suddenly found themselves overwhelmed with volunteers, eager to serve under the general who had humiliated the British. British loyalists throughout the colonies found their position increasingly precarious as news of the Princeton victory spread. Many who had openly supported the Crown now began to question whether they had chosen the winning side. The psychological warfare that Washington had waged so effectively was beginning to erode the base of support upon which British strategy ultimately depended. The financial markets in London reflected the growing uncertainty about the war's outcome. Government bonds fell sharply as investors began to question whether Britain possessed the resources to sustain a prolonged conflict against an enemy that had proven far more capable than initially estimated. The enormous cost of maintaining large armies in America was becoming a political liability that would influence all future strategic decisions. Military historians would later identify the Princeton campaign as the moment when the American Revolution truly began. The earlier battles had been largely defensive actions fought by Americans trying to survive against overwhelming odds. Princeton represented the first successful American offensive operation, demonstrating that the Continental Army had evolved from a collection of militia units into a professional military force capable of complex strategic maneuvers. The victory's impact on international opinion was equally significant. European military observers, who had been skeptical of American capabilities, now began to reassess their evaluation of the conflict. The speed and precision of Washington's movements, combined with the tactical skill displayed at Princeton, suggested that the Americans possessed military leadership of the highest caliber. As recorded in the diary of Continental Army Surgeon Dr. James Thacker, a Princeton victory marked the dawn of a new day for American arms. The transformation in military morale was so complete that men who had been ready to abandon the cause just days before now spoke confidently of ultimate victory and independence. The Battle of Princeton established George Washington as one of the great military commanders of his era, transforming him from a colonial planter who had suffered a series of humiliating defeats into a strategic genius capable of outmaneuvering the finest generals of the British Empire. The victory demonstrated that American forces, when properly led and motivated, could compete with any army in the world. This transformation in both perception and reality would prove crucial to the ultimate success of the American Revolution. The tactical innovations displayed at Princeton would influence military doctrine for generations to come. Washington's use of multiple converging columns, combined with the effective integration of artillery and infantry, demonstrated principles that would later be codified in military academies throughout the world. The speed and precision of the American movements showed that citizen soldiers could master the complex maneuvers previously associated only with professional armies. The strategic consequences of the Princeton victory extended far beyond the immediate military situation. The British were forced to abandon their strategy of controlling territory through static garrisons, recognizing that American forces could strike anywhere at any time.
Oh.
This shift from territorial control to population protection would ultimately prove disastrous. 4. British hopes of suppressing the rebellion. The international implications of the Princeton victory were equally profound. French Foreign Minister Vergennes, who had been secretly supporting the Americans with limited supplies, now began serious negotiations for a formal alliance. The demonstration that American forces could defeat British regulars in open battle provided the evidence France needed to justify open support for the rebellion. The psychological impact on British public opinion was severe and lasting. The myth of British military invincibility, which had been carefully cultivated through decades of colonial warfare, lay shattered in the frozen fields of New Jersey. Parliament would soon be forced to confront the reality that the American war was consuming enormous resources while producing negligible results. American morale, which had reached its lowest point during the retreat across New Jersey, was completely restored by the Princeton victory. The knowledge that they could defeat professional European troops in battle gave American soldiers a confidence that would sustain them through the darkest days of the war. The Continental Army had finally proved itself worthy of the cause it served. The Battle of Princeton also marked the emergence of a new generation of American military leaders. Officers like Alexander Hamilton, James Monroe, and Aaron Burr had distinguished themselves in the fighting, gaining experience that would serve them well in both military and political careers. The battle had forged a cadre of leaders who would guide the nation through its formative years. The victory's impact on American logistics and supply was immediately apparent. The capture of British stores and equipment provided the Continental Army with resources that would sustain operations for months to come. More importantly, the demonstration of American military competence encouraged increased private support for the war effort, as wealthy patriots began to view the cause as a worthwhile investment. The Princeton battlefield became a symbol of American determination and capability that would inspire future generations of soldiers and citizens. The knowledge that a small group of dedicated patriots could defeat seemingly overwhelming odds would become a cornerstone of American military tradition and national identity. British strategy never recovered from the Princeton disaster. The defeats at Trenton and Princeton forced a complete reassessment of the war effort, leading to changes in command structure and strategic objectives that would ultimately prove inadequate. The initiative had passed to the Americans, and they would never relinquish it. The victory at Princeton proved that the American Revolution was not merely a colonial uprising, but a war of independence that would reshape the global balance of power. The demonstration that ordinary citizens could defeat professional armies would inspire democratic movements throughout Europe and beyond, making the American cause a symbol of popular resistance to tyranny. The legacy of Princeton extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. The battle had demonstrated that Americans possessed the courage, skill, and determination necessary to win their independence. The victory marked the moment when the American Revolution truly began, transforming a desperate struggle for survival into a confident march toward liberty. As Washington's army settled into winter quarters at Morristown, the men who had fought at Princeton carried with them the knowledge that they had participated in one of the most significant battles in American history. The frozen ground of New Jersey had witnessed the birth of a nation, and the echoes of that victory would resonate through the centuries to come. The Battle of Princeton had proven that the American cause was not lost, but triumphant, and that the pursuit of liberty would ultimately prevail against all odds.